Hi everyone, it's Jenny from the Wow Creative team. Today my video focuses on quick and easy heat embossed Christmas cards. All of the techniques I'm going to show you in today's video can be easily replicated to mass produce Christmas cards or whatever type of card it is that you want to build up in your stash. And my cards today have a very modern feel to them, but you can also change this up using different supplies, and I'll give you some tips along the way. So first of all, I'm using coloured cardstock. I've chosen some super bright colours and I'm going to pair those with embossing powders that coordinate really well. I'm using some unusual Christmas colours. You could choose your traditional reds or greens for your card base, or white depending on the feel of your card. I'm also using some opaque embossing powder. That's really important when using darker coloured cardstock because you want it to show up. And then I've got a selection of sentiment dies and background stamps. My first tip for mass producing is to use a stamp positioning tool because these make it super quick and easy to stamp any of your background stamps, or you could use large stamps, acrylic stamps. You don't have to use background stamps, but it means using a stamp positioning tool you can quickly swap them out, add in a new piece of cardstock and produce several cards very, very quickly. I use a Misty, that's my favourite stamp positioning tool, but you can use any of the ones you have. And first off, I'm using this Reindeer Stamp from Simon Says Stamp. I've placed my Doll Pink cardstock, that's by Simon Says Stamp, in my Misty, and I can't use a magnet because I want to make sure I get an all over pattern, so I've added a bit of tape runner just to the back of the cardstock. I have removed the mouse pad because this is a red rubber stamp, and I've inked my stamp up with Wow embossing ink, and I have treated my panel of cardstock with a powder tool. I'm then going to heat emboss it in Florida Sunset. This is a gorgeous embossing powder from Wow. It's got chunks of gold in it and it's got some pink sprinkled in, which doesn't show up as well on this pink cardstock, but you can see that it's sort of a semi-translucent pink scattered in amongst those reindeer. And then I've heated it up with my heat tool. I'm going to do all three backgrounds up front, and then I'm going to show you how I finish the cards later on in the video. My next background stamp is the Clean Line Trees background from Simon Says Stamp. This has got quite a fine pattern, as indicated by the name, so I'm going to be using a super fine embossing powder for this one. I'm using teal cardstock from Gina K Designs, and I'm going to be using super fine metallic copper embossing powder, which is an opaque embossing powder, and it goes beautifully with this teal cardstock. I am going to be using the regular copper embossing powder a little bit later on in this video, and I just wanted to show you that they do have different uses. It's okay if you don't have both grades of powder. They both work for both of the techniques I'm showing you here, but you get a crisper impression with the super fine embossing powder, and I'll show you what the regular is better for a bit later on in this video. So I'm just going to tap it on over my cardstock. I have again treated it with my powder tool and then heat it up with my Wow dual heat gun. I like to use setting 2, and I like to keep it good and hot before I then take it to the paper. I have sped it up here. Obviously it's not this quick, but look at the colour of the contrast of the copper against that teal. It's such a nice colour combo. I'm now using the Leaves and Berries background stamp from Simon Says Stamp, and this one is a great background. It looks Christmassy. I think it was part of their Christmas release recently. However, you could use this for any kind of card. It doesn't scream Christmas. I'm heat embossing it on bright yellow cardstock from Simon Says Stamp, and I'm gonna use Metalline Greengage embossing powder. This is an opaque green, and it's got this really nice kind of metallic sheen to it. There is a range of Metalline powders by Wow, and they've all got that really nice kind of sheen. Some of them are more of a silver sheen, others are a gold sheen, but they show up really well on coloured cardstock. And the trick to knowing which are the opaque ones, if you've got a few in your stash, is they'll have an O on the label typically. If they've got a T, that means they're translucent, and they will be not as clear when you use them on darker coloured cardstock. So here's a look at the three backgrounds I've created. So I'm going to show you how I finished the cards now. So I'm using white note cards. I've trimmed down my teal piece to add a 1/4 inch border all around the outside, and then adhered it directly to the card. And then using this Merry frame, and I've die cut it twice from white cardstock and then adhered the frame and the Merry word together with some liquid glue. But what I wanted to show you is the backer piece that also die cuts out when you run it through your machine. I'm going to heat emboss it. So I'm going to dunk it into my embossing pad, get it nice and covered in ink, which I have recently re-inked. I wouldn't worry about that black mark on it. I accidentally used an inky stamp, but it's absolutely fine when I'm using opaque embossing powder. I might need to get a new one for translucent embossing powder. So I've dunked it all over, and now I'm adding regular metallic copper embossing powder. And the reason for that is they're bigger granules. It means that I have to add less layers to get a nice solid embossed image. And so you'll see, actually I could have got away with just doing one layer there, but just for good measure I dunked it in my ink again and added one more layer. Now if you were using superfine, you might have to add a third layer just to make sure it's fully opaque and covered. I'm then going to add some liquid glue, pop that onto the centre of my card and put an acrylic block over the top just to make sure that it stays stuck down while the glue dries. And then I'm going to add some liquid glue to the back of the frame and to the back of the sentiment and adhere those to the centre of the copper background. And a little liquid glue does squeeze out, but I just go in with my pokey tool and kind of wipe it off. And that's why these techniques, they are super fast. I'm not doing any fancy stamping. I'm just using background stamps and sentiment dies and embossing. And each of these cards probably took me no more than 6 or 7 minutes to make. And if you've got a full assembly line going on for mass production, you could probably crank out 40 or 50 cards in fairly short space of time. I'm now using the Joyful frame die from Simon Says Stamp, and I'm going to repeat the exact same process that I used for the Merry card, and this time I'm going to coordinate it with the Hot Pink and Florida Sunset card. So I'm going to pour Florida Sunset all over this die cut a couple of times. The difference with this one is I'm not using the die cut letters, I'm using the frame with the letters that have been cut out, which is much quicker and easier to mass produce. I do, because I'm picky, go back in and add the centre to that O, but you totally don't need to. So I kept, you'll see up in the top right corner, I kept the centre of the O, and I actually went and heat embossed it to keep, but that's kind of fiddly, so I wouldn't necessarily say if you're doing mass production and you want to make a lot of these cards, that's not the quickest way to do it. And you can see here, so by changing the background, you can change it from Christmas to maybe Easter, if you have any Easter cards, background stamps, or if you have any geometric background stamps. You can completely change the look and feel of these cards. You can change the cardstock, so you could go maybe for gold on navy, or you could go for any of your translucent powders on white cardstock. And you can quickly create a lot of heat embossed backgrounds, and then just by heat embossing some of your more interesting sentiment dies, you've got a complete card. Add that matte round the outside and coordinate it with that die cut, and you've got a complete card. You don't need any extra embellishments. Now for my third card, I didn't add a border around the edge. What I'm going to be doing is adding this Merry and Bright sentiment from the Holiday Sentiments Mix 1 by Simon Says Stamp directly over the top of my heat embossed piece. So you want to make sure first of all that your heat gun is very hot. It's like leave it for a minute to heat up, because you don't want to have it pointed at the card panel too long, because you run the risk of remelting that first background embossing. And I'm going to come back in with my copper embossing powder, because this is a thick sentiment. I'm just using the regular embossing powder here, and I've stamped it directly over the top. I've used my powder tool over that embossed panel first and foremost, and then I'm going to heat it up with my heat gun. And if you leave your stamp in your mister, you can come back in and do another, but I like that texture where the copper embossing powder overlays with the Greengage. And I just left it at that. So it's like super bright and super quick and easy to make, and really modern to boot. And that finishes all 3 cards. I hope you've enjoyed. Be sure to check out the other tutorials on the WOW channel, and thanks for watching. Have a good day. Bye.